Dream again? Are you ready to dream again? To pursue greater heights? To achieve greater success? God is waiting for us to step out in faith, to take risks, great risks. Let us stand, please, and let's go to the Scriptures. I've titled the message this morning, Risky Business. We're going to look there in Ruth chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. Ruth chapter 3, verse 7 through 9. It says, when Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." You may be seated. And after reading this passage here, you might not think that that was risky business for Ruth to approach Boaz. But let me put it within context of the culture at that time. You see, there's a well-known religious practice called Shomer Negah, which literally means to keep from touching. It meant that members of the opposite sex were not to come into physical contact. This prohibition regarding touch is derived from verses 6 and 19 of Leviticus chapter 18 and is still strictly enforced by some ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities today. It was inappropriate for a woman to touch a man. And ultra-Orthodox Jews and the customs of that time, it was not permissible, not allowed for a woman to approach or to touch a man. Let me just read briefly Leviticus 18:6. "No one is to approach any close relative to have sexual relations. I am the Lord." And then Leviticus 18:19. "Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period." So the religious leaders, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were well known for taking things out of context. They were well known for adding laws on top of God's commandments. And this is a case in point where they institute a religious practice known as Shomer Negah. In other words, single men are not to touch single women and vice versa. They're to completely keep themselves to themselves. And so for Ruth to approach Boaz and to touch his garment was risky business. So many things could have happened to Ruth. In our study this morning, it was mentioned how Ruth just simply getting to that place at night was risky business. Just making that trek by herself, a woman at night, making that trek to meet up with Boaz. It was also risky business given the fact that if she had been spotted, been seen going to that location, would have been detrimental to her. It was also risky business knowing that she had no idea what Boaz's response would be, how he would handle that, her approaching him, especially at night. He was obviously there protecting his crop there, and so he was probably on edge, expecting somebody maybe to come and try to steal his crop. And so at night, being very difficult to see, who knows what could have happened to Ruth had she approached Boaz, and him being startled, he might have accidentally, inadvertently hurt her. So there was a lot of risk she took to her integrity, her reputation, by approaching Boaz in this manner at night. We know that the religious leaders took Leviticus 18:6 and 19 out of context. We know that it was not against God's law for a woman to touch a man, a single woman to touch a single man. We know that from Luke chapter 7. It's not in your notes. Luke chapter 7. We recall when the woman came to Jesus and she wept and wet his feet with her tears, and she never ceased to stop kissing Jesus' feet. She came into contact with Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Had this been inappropriate, had this been something that Jesus would have frowned upon, he would have told the woman right then and there to stop doing that. But no, he didn't. So we know that the religious leaders had instituted a law, a religious practice called Shomer Negah, and by all sense of the word, she had violated that command and could have come under some strict punishment. But she took a risk. She listened to her mother-in-law, Naomi. In verse 14, Boaz reinforces the danger that Ruth was in by saying, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Even Boaz recognized the risk and the danger that Ruth was in. If we were to look at Mark chapter 5, 27 through 33, this religious instituted practice, Shomer Negah, is in full effect. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had come out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. It was risky business for a woman to touch a man. It was risky business for a woman to approach a man at night. Ruth was taking a great risk in going to Boaz, but Ruth set aside the risk for the promise of God. Ruth knew that Naomi was telling her the truth, that Naomi, being a God-fearing woman, was listening to God, and that the instructions that Naomi was giving to Ruth were of the Lord. And therefore she put her focus on God and not on the risk. She knew that there was danger, she knew that there was risk, but she also knew this God that Naomi, her mother-in-law, worshiped and served was greater than her risk, greater than her worries, greater than her fears. She put it all in context, all in perspective. And that's what we need to do today as well. Put it all in perspective. If your God is not bigger than your risk, your worries, then it's not the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, whose son is Jesus Christ and whose spirit fills all who will put their trust in Jesus Christ. How big is your God? That'll determine how big your problem is. If you've got a big God, you've got a small problem. If you've got a small God, you've got a big problem. Put it all in perspective. Keep it in perspective. Is your God the one who parted the sea, who shut the mouths of the lions, who raised the dead, who calmed the sea, who made it solid enough for Peter to walk upon it? Is that your God? Is he the one who hung the stars in the heavens? Who set the sun ablaze and the moon to glow? Is that your God? Is your God the one who slew Goliath? Is it your God that delivered his people out of Egypt? Is that your God? Is it your God who took sin upon the cross and defeated Satan? Is that your God? If that's your God, then your problems are small when compared to him. You see, it's a matter of our focus. It's a matter of our perspective. It all comes down to where are we placing our focus, our attention? Where are we looking? Are we looking up? Are we looking down? You see, if you're looking up, you're not looking at your problem. You're looking at the solution to your problem. Where are your eyes fixated? Are they on your God or on your problem? If they're on your God, then you see the solution to the problem. It's very clear, very evident who's going to fix it. Yes, he may use you to do it, but through the power and the strength of the Holy Spirit. It took Ruth relying on the Holy Spirit, trusting in her God to make this move. We read it and if we don't stop and really think about what she was doing and what she was going through and the risk she was taking, then we might not think that she took any risk at all. But she did. Her life was in danger. Her reputation was in danger. Her whole future was in danger. It was all at risk. But it was a risk she was willing to take because she saw how big the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob truly is. Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you never take. You miss 100% of the shots you never take. Imagine what would have happened if Ruth had not stepped out in faith, if Ruth had not risked everything to obey God. You see, obeying God is going to come at a risk. It's going to be risky business. Was it not risky business for David to go up against Goliath? Oh, absolutely. The odds were stacked against him. The odds were stacked against Ruth. But when your God is in the fight, when your God is orchestrating your life, when it is His plan you're following for your life, then it can only end in God's glory and your good. What holds us back from taking risks? What keeps us from stepping out in faith, if not fear? But fear of what? What are we afraid of? We're afraid of rejection, ostracism, failure, emotional, physical harm, public humiliation, alienation, all of the above. You see, when we start looking at what it's going to cost us to follow Jesus, fear and worry and doubt creep in. We start counting what we might or possibly could lose by following Jesus. I've witnessed to a number of people, and I've shared about how much Jesus wants to clean their lives up and how He wants to come in and give them a new life, a new hope, a new future. And as I'm sharing this with them, I can see very clearly that they're counting, okay, well, what am I going to have to give up to follow Jesus? I'm going to have to give up alcohol. Am I going to have to give up cigarettes? Am I going to have to stop watching pornography? Am I going to have to stop doing all these things that I'm enjoying doing right now to follow Jesus? Oh, you know what, Jesus? Oh, that's too risky. I don't know what my life would be like without those things. Fear. Matthew 10:36 says, a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Oftentimes people think, well, if I give my life to Jesus, well, then my family's going to alienate me. I'll be realistic. You just might be alienated. That comes at a risk. Jesus was alienated. His own family mocked him, made fun of him so much so that we don't find in the scriptures where he ever went back home. He left, walked away. The door was always open for his family members to come and visit him, and we see later on in the scriptures where they did. His mother and brothers and sisters went looking for their Jesus. They found him. Maybe for your young folks, it's going to mean that you might lose some friends, some relationships, because you're not going to be wanting to do the things that your friends are currently doing, that you're currently doing. It happens to us all. To follow Jesus will come at a risk. It'll come at a cost. And many of us are counting the risk, the cost to follow Christ. And if we place more value on what we perceive as the losses, if we consider the risk too high, we're not going to follow Jesus. Jesus says that those who love the world are enemies of God. You can't serve Mammon and God. In other words, you can't pursue the things of this world that are dragging people down, that are destroying lives, corrupting, and think that you can yet still follow Jesus. There's no gray area there. Let me ask you this. What would you do if you were not afraid? What would you do if you were not afraid? Think about how your decisions would be impacted if you were not afraid to step out in faith and take risks. What would your life look like today if you were not afraid to trust in Jesus holistically? You see, fear is that little dark room where negatives are developed. Fear is that little dark room where negatives are developed, Michael Pritchard wrote. You see, when we allow fear to creep in, we begin to think of all the negative. What we're going to lose, what we're not going to have, what our lives are going to be like. We start making up this negative life. It really is. It's very negative. And it forces us to make decisions we wouldn't make if we were unafraid. You see, everything you want is on the other side of fear. It really is. Everything we really want, everything worth something valuable is on the other side of fear. Because those treasures, those gifts, those wonders are going to take for us to step out in faith, trusting in our God. In 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. Fear was not handed to you by God. Let's recognize this up front. God didn't instill you with fear. He didn't give you fear. It didn't come from Him. And I'm talking about that fear of the world. We are to have a reverent fear of God. This is true. Acknowledging that He is the one true God, omnipotent, omniscient. There is to be that reverent fear of God. But that fear that causes you to disobey God, that fear that causes you to turn your back on God, that fear that causes you to embrace the world, that fear that causes you to choose the things of this world rather than the things of God, that is not a fear that God has given us. That is a fear that is instilled by the devil himself. And we need to remember that Satan recognizes that if he can cause you to be afraid, then you won't take risks. You won't step out in faith. You won't trust in God. You remember Peter. Jesus bid me to come unto you, Jesus. And he said, come, Peter. As long as Peter kept his focus on Christ, he walked on water. But when he turned from Jesus and began to look at the waves, he looked at the tempest, the storm that was raging about him, he lost his focus and began to sink and cried out, Jesus, save me. Who's in your boat today? You recall when the disciples were there on the water with Jesus and that storm rose up? They began to panic and they became afraid. You see, they forgot that Jesus was in the boat with them. But they looked at the storm, at the waves crashing in upon them, and they became afraid. And yet Jesus was right there in the boat. The problem is that the waves were bigger than their God. And for some of us, the waves in our life, the tempest, the storms in our lives are bigger than our God. How big is your God? Everything you want is on the other side of fear. But there's also another obstacle in front of us: disbelief. Disbelief. We simply don't believe that God will act in our best interest. It's sad to say that, but that's really what it is. We don't believe that God is actually going to keep His promises. We believe God is trustworthy when we don't have to trust in Him, right? We believe God is trustworthy when we don't have to trust in Him. We believe He's faithful until we have to step out in faith. We believe God is faithful until we have to step out in faith. Then there's a problem, right? We believe He cares right up until we have to place ourselves in His care. We believe God cares until we have to place ourselves in His care. That's when the problem enters in. We believe He's strong until we have to rely on His strength to deliver us. God is great. God is good. We'll hear people say that all the time. Oh, He's omnipotent. He's all-knowing. He's powerful. He's great. And then we shake and we quiver when we encounter obstacles and challenging times. We become deadly afraid. Well, what happened to those moments and those times when we're praising God about how great and how good He is and how wonderful He is and how He loves to care for His children and how He encamps His angels around them? We somehow lose focus of that. And we don't step out in faith and we don't take risks. Because again, our focus is not on our God, but on our problems. In James 1, 6 through 8, he pointedly says, but when we ask, he asks, he must believe and not doubt, because he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That man should not think he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all he does. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. Don't doubt God's promises. Don't doubt God's truth. David didn't doubt God's power to deliver him, and God delivered him. Daniel didn't doubt God's power of deliverance, and God delivered him through the lion's den. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't doubt in God's power, and God delivered them through the fiery furnace. What's on the other side of fear? Is it not the reward that God promises you? Is it not the treasured possessions? Is it not the good and perfect gifts that are reserved for you and for me? Are they not there on the other side of fear? Yes, they are. But in order to reach them, we have to pass through that fear. We have to go through the fiery flames of the furnace to battle the Goliaths in our lives, to go through the lion's den, through the water. We've got to go through it to get to the rewards. Mark chapter 5, verse 34. I read earlier Mark 5, 27 to 33. Let's see how it ended for that woman that reached out and touched Jesus, even though she was unclean because of that time of the month. Mark 5:34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Had that woman not stepped out in faith, had she not put her life at risk, she would have never been healed. She had to overcome those fears, those doubts, the trepidation to receive the blessing. It was there. David had to go up against Goliath in order to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. Now think about Daniel, how King Darius, because Daniel refused the king's edict, which was that he could not bow down and worship his God. He could not pray to his God. Daniel put his life at risk to pray to his God. And because he did that, not only did King Darius come to believe, but he issued the edict that the God of Daniel was the one true God, and that all the townspeople, all those there, near and far, were to worship the one true God. It took Daniel stepping out in faith, risking his life to bring a man to his knees, to recognize that the one true God was Daniel's God. It's going to take you and me stepping out in faith, risking maybe even our lives for some to come to believe in Jesus Christ. We know that's happening in third world countries today, how our brothers and sisters in Christ, especially in the Middle East, are putting their lives at risk to save the lost. You might lose a relationship, a friendship, by stepping out and telling them about the love of Jesus. It's going to oftentimes come at a cost. But it's a risk worth taking, well worth taking. For our God is bigger than any problem you and I will ever face. Any challenge, physical, emotional, spiritual, financial. Whatever it is, our God can overcome it. What He needs from you and me is to step out in faith. You see, no risk, no reward. No risk, no reward. You got to step through the fiery furnace. You got to walk through the lion's den to receive those treasures, those good and perfect gifts God has prepared for you and for me. He has a plan for you and for me. The question is, will we step out in faith like Ruth did? Will we trust that our God is capable of delivering us if He so chooses to do so? I love Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response to the king when they said, even if our God does not save us, we will not bow down and worship your graven image. Daniel, David, they all knew that they were stepping out. They were all risking their lives. But their love for their God was far greater than their love for their lives. Ruth, her love for her God was far greater than her love for her reputation, far greater than her love for her own physical well-being, far greater than her love for her future. When God asks you to do something, it's probably going to sound very unorthodox to you and me. It's probably not going to agree with what society would say is right and what society would say is good. But if God asks you to do this, if He asks you to do it, then understand this: there's not going to be any sin involved. If it's of God, it will be a good thing, and there will be no sin involved. Ruth didn't sin. Daniel didn't sin. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't sin. Yet they took great risks. And you and I are going to have to take some risks. What risk are you going to have to take in order to embrace what God has prepared just for you? You know what it is. Will you be willing to step out in faith? Let's bow our heads now. Let's go to the Father in prayer. Let's ask Him to strip us of fear, to strip us of trepidation, of worry, of doubt, so that we may embrace His good and perfect gift.